Let's start with a very interesting Reddit story from Bobby Bumblebee. Welcome to the unending notebook emporium. When I was a student, I earned some extra money by working in a stationery shop in a university town. I only worked at weekends, and since there were no deliveries or post-lecture rushes, we usually had 3 of us on duty. At first, it was me, Electron, a physics student with little time for humans, and Josh, the weekend manager. Josh was a surfer dude, always really relaxed, knew that most of the job was and freely told us that the only thing he liked was chatting with us and the customers. We developed a great group of repeat customers who liked the store being quieter and being able to talk to us about whatever problem they had. On that basis, Josh had agreed a policy whereby the weekday team did all the scheduled tasks when there were more staff on duty. But on weekends, all we did was filling empty shelves and sales. Unfortunately, Josh's main job as a water sports instructor was really taking off, and his days of selling paperclips were over. Neither I nor Electron had any interest in being responsible for keys, cash balancing, and explaining to sketchy folk why we'd stopped selling those little resealable plastic bags, so we didn't inquire about the weekend manager job, and we weren't asked either. Apparently, a weekday worker, Susan, wanted the hours. I liked Susan. She often took weekend shifts when one of us was out of town, and she blended in well with our team. But a storm was brewing. The owner had decided that weekend manager was a pointless job title, and that an experienced salesperson could handle the weekend crew. So when Susan was offered the opportunity to run the weekend team, it was not on the management pay scale. It was with a $1 per hour supplement. I genuinely did feel sorry for her. Neither me nor Electron would have taken on the responsibility for $8 more per shift. She negotiated him up to $1.50 per hour, but most importantly for her, agreed that though contractually she'd be a salesperson, at weekends she must be referred to as manager. I know because she spent the first month drilling this point home, and she printed out a special badge that said manager. Then got upset when the store's assistant manager, Alice, told her she wasn't allowed to wear it on weekdays. This created a rift that Alice never forgot. Alice told us, when covering one weekend, that Susan had also promised everyone that she would whip the weekend team into shape, and that Josh had allowed us to become lazy. Alice thought the whole thing was hilarious, and said that it was pointless anyway. The owner had far bigger priorities than this store, and as long as we were ticking over a profit, he really couldn't care less about the sales volumes from one week to the next or who worked what shift. To get Susan out of his hair, he'd agreed that if she boosted sales in her first 2 months, she'd get a reward. And wouldn't you know, in the first 2 months, which happened to be a new academic year, sales were indeed boosted. She got a $25 gift voucher for another store he owned, and she told Electron and me that it was a clear example of how hard work pays off. We simply needed to apply ourselves and follow her instructions. One Sunday, I was talking to a student who wanted to buy a USB stick for their university work. I was talking about how to back up your data, and that a single USB stick might not be sufficient. Electron was explaining something that I didn't understand to someone who I also could not understand. Susan emerged from the small office at the back of the store, where she had started to spend most of her time working on the system. It was very unclear what the system did or why it had worked so effortlessly during Josh's tenure and now required constant babysitting, but her time with the system was unavoidable and critical to our success. "This shelf isn't full," she said to the open floor. I turned around, and she was pointing at a shelf of notebooks. The owner had struck a killer deal on multiple pallets of garishly colored notebooks, and now we had thousands of them in the stockroom. The weekday team had put about 100 of them onto a shelf, but as they were cheap and selling quickly, a fairly noticeable gap had developed. Normally, I'd grab some when I happened to go into the stockroom for something else, but that hadn't happened in a while. I went back to talking to the customer, but then she grabbed my shoulder and jerked it back. "Bobby Bumblebee," she said. "When I ask a question, I expect a response." The young guy I was talking to looked horrified and started to back away. "Are you buying that?" she asked him, pointing at the USB stick in his hands. He shook his head, muttered something apologetically, and put it back on the shelf before rushing out of the shop. "Another time waster," she said to me. "No more wasting time on chat. You're either at the register selling or you're filling shelves. We've got plenty of notebooks in the stockroom, and there's no excuse for empty shelves. I expect every space filled." She turned and marched back to the little office. She looked over at Electron and pointed at him. "That goes for you too, Electron." He looked back at her with a look of total confusion, but he usually did so. It didn't stand out. Then, as she slammed the office door behind her, a light bulb went off in my head. "Electron," I said, "did you hear her say every space?" He nodded and started to smile. He apologized to his customer for no longer being permitted to talk to them, and we started a Herculean tag team effort in the stockroom. I brought out the first batch on the trolley and filled the notebook shelf. It looked pretty good. We were waiting for a shipment of printer paper, so there was a big gap in that section. Not anymore. I stacked those notebooks a yard high. I thought Susan might hear the noise and come out, but she was far too busy. Electron spent some time manning the register, but mostly we were filling shelves. Until eventually, we had filled the shelves. It looked like a kid had eaten a pack of highlighters and spewed across the entire store. I realized, though, that she'd said every space, not every shelf. I created a new tower near to the office door. It was a majestic sight, almost 6 feet high in the center. Electron crowned it with a roll of sparkly glitter tape. To me, it was my Washington monument. It was at this point that I heard it. "What the hell?" See, the one thing I knew that no one else did was that Alice was coming in at the end of the day to collect some paperwork. "Welcome to the unending notebook emporium," I said. I then told Alice how we had been berated earlier in the day and that we were now following Susan's strict instructions. Thankfully, Alice thought this was hilarious. She did ask, though, how Susan had failed to notice what we were doing. "She's been working on the system for the last 3 hours," I explained. Alice went up to the door, but rather than knocking on it, she just flung it open. Susan had been sitting on the office chair with her feet on the desk reading a novel, but had jolted herself so violently that the chair had shot out from behind her, and she was now rolling around on the floor. Alice closed the shop, told Electron and me that she'd get things straightened out and we should report as usual the following weekend. I wish I could say that Susan was fired and that Alice had taken over weekend management, but for some reason, Alice and the store manager decided to give her a second chance. Susan did have to stay late to move all of the notebooks spread across random shelves to my notebook tower, though I must say with less architectural flair than I had done. It still stood, although slightly diminished, a week later when I came back for my next shift. I've no idea what was said to Susan after the store closed, but she never wore the badge or shouted again. She also spent a lot more time on the floor and started to give us extremely clear instructions with absolutely no ambiguity. This was a great source of amusement for Electron, who occasionally played up to it. My personal favorite being when he asked if selling as much printer ink as possible meant he should lower the price to 1 cent. A few months later, both Electron and I finished our degrees and left. Neither of us worked in retail again. Electron went on to gain a PhD in physics, and we are still in touch, but I still have no idea what he is talking about or what he does for a living. Alice later took over as the store manager, and Susan, as far as I can make out, left a couple of years after me and now works as the assistant manager of a nearby supermarket. I like to think that she treats people better now, but who knows? At the very least, I hope that every time she sees a notebook, she remembers the day she spawned the unending notebook emporium. TLDR. New manager slacks off, tells us to work harder, and learns that when you push people too far, instead of working as you hoped they would, they build wonderful architectural marvels. The story is very interesting generally, but there is nothing in it that makes it a malicious compliance. Whatever, OP learned a passive-aggressive lesson in leadership. The next story from Nova Evil Capitalist. Car dealer tells me I should waste my time and go to a competing dealer because they also won't give me the price they list on their website. This is a rather long, detailed story, so if you're the impatient sort, please skip to the bottom, though note you're missing out on fun details. This took place 8 years ago when I was buying my first new car, not just a new-to-me car. I spent a good amount of time researching the options available, both in terms of other models from other manufacturers and option packages on the car in which I was most interested, so I knew exactly what I wanted coming in the door. In 2014, car dealer websites hadn't quite gotten to the level of borderline bait-and-switch trickery you see these days, so if a dealer's website said they had a particular car on the lot at a particular price, they almost certainly did. There were several in the region that matched what I was looking for, one specifically at my existing dealership. This wasn't a smaller dealership, it was one of the largest in the Northern Virginia area for this particular brand. I had had a reasonably good experience with their service department overall and figured I'd give their sales department a chance to shine. That was my first mistake. I showed up on a Wednesday after work. It was early June, so with the mercury being in the upper 90s, I was dressed in a comfortable but still very presentable combination of a polo shirt and khaki shorts. When I entered the sales side of the dealership, I could see what appeared to be all the salespeople in a conference room laughing and joking while taking scissors to the tie of one of the men present. Later, I found out that was a rite of passage after making your first sale. I waited around for a minute or two as the conference room had glass walls, and it would be impossible not to notice me as I'm not exactly a small fellow at 6 feet, 6 inches tall. When no one came out to greet me, I went up to the receptionist's desk and said, "Hi, I'm interested in model of car, and there's one in stock I'd like to see." Her response, without even looking up from her phone, was, "Okay." I stood there for another 20 seconds or so and then politely asked, "Would someone be able to show me that car?" This finally prompted her to look up from her phone. She looked me up and down, scoffed a bit, and said she'd go and get someone. I was willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, hoping that things would turn around. That was my second mistake. The receptionist came back with what looked like the youngest, most wet behind the ears salesperson she could find, as evidently I wasn't worth the time of the more experienced folks. I explained that I was interested in a car that their website said they had in stock and provided him with the printout, showing the stock number, price, and all other pertinent details. It took him a while to find the car on the lot, but after a brief test drive, I knew it was what I wanted, and began the sales process. I had a trade-in, which had been primarily serviced by them, and for which I already had a written offer from CarMax, so I knew how much I should receive for it. He quoted me just over half of that figure. When I pointed out that I could get several thousand more by taking it to the CarMax just up the road, and had a written offer from them for that specific amount, he went and got his sales manager, who offered to drive me there and pick me up afterwards, but that they wouldn't match what CarMax offered. I was a bit surprised that they didn't want a nice used car to sell for themselves. 6 years old, top of the line, reasonable mileage, and serviced by them specifically. But again, cut them more slack than they deserved. When we got to price, things really fell apart. He quoted me a price that was several $1,000s higher than what they displayed on their website. When I showed him the printout again, with the noticeably lower price, he looked to the sales manager for guidance. The sales manager immediately took the line that the price listed includes all available rebates and special offers, and you may not qualify for all of them. I was now frustrated and showed them printouts from the other dealers in the area that had a similar price shown, and said that if they weren't willing to honor the price listed on their website, I'd just go to the next closest dealer that had that model in stock at that price. His response sealed the deal for me. Go ahead, waste your time, and go to competing dealership. We won't hold it against you when you come back here. I told them, okay, thank you for your time. I'll go to competing dealership, and got up to leave. No one stopped me, and the receptionist said nothing as I walked past her out to the parking lot to drive to the other dealership. When I got to the competing dealership, it was already around 8 p.m. as I had spent a fair amount of time at the first dealership, and Northern Virginia traffic has never been known for being reasonable. I had a salesperson approach me immediately upon entering the dealership, and I explained, "I've just come from first dealership and want to buy particular model of car. Both of you have that car in stock with the options I want." They wouldn't give it to me at the price shown on their website. "If you will, I'm ready to sign on the dotted line right now." The salesperson immediately took me to his office, verified that they had the car, and confirmed that yes, the price on their website was accurate, and I could walk out the door with that price. We started the process, and when we got to the trade-in, I further explained how the other dealership tried to lowball me on the trade. He said if I could produce a written offer from CarMax for the price I mentioned, they would match it. I gave him that paperwork, and without any further discussion, he agreed they would match that, and we moved on to financing. I hadn't gotten this far with the other dealer, but I had already lined up financing through my credit union. He asked if I'd be willing to see if his F&I guy could match or beat that figure. I agreed to let him try, and he came back with a rate that was 50 basis points lower. Needless to say, I was already very happy with these people, but that definitely sealed the deal. Right as I was finishing the paperwork, the salesperson from the first dealer texted me to ask if they would give me the car at that price. I responded back that they would, and I was finishing up the paperwork at that very moment. He immediately tried to call me, then texted me saying he'd give it to me for $500 less. I responded to his text stating that I'd already signed the paperwork and he had lost the sale. Once the paperwork was complete, the exceptionally pleasant and helpful salesperson at my new dealership spent an additional half hour after the dealership had closed for the night, running me through some of the features of the car and showing me how the infotainment system worked. This was completely above and beyond what I expected, as I thought I'd just be reading the 300-page user manual to figure it out on my own. I drove home that night with my shiny new car, a very happy camper. The next day, I decided to rub a little salt in the wounds of the first dealership, so I drove there straight from the office. For context, I work in the banking industry, and at that point, it was still very much business formal dress. I showed up in my suit with my briefcase and had people falling all over themselves trying to help me, including the receptionist who clearly remembered who I was midway through me asking for the particular salesperson I dealt with the prior day. She offered me a seat and asked if I wanted some coffee while she went to get him, and I politely said, "No, thank you. I won't be here long." She, somewhat quietly, sheepishly, responded that she'd be back with that salesperson very shortly. There was a couple in the waiting area who seemed a bit displeased that they'd been waiting for a salesperson, but I got one the moment I walked in the door. No more than a minute later, the salesperson and his manager came out. The salesperson recognized me, and with a look of defeat on his face, shook my hand and asked how I was today. Before I had a chance to respond, the sales manager spoke up to introduce himself as if I hadn't spent an hour and a half with him the previous day. After I reminded him that I was there yesterday, and he had said it would be a waste of time to go the competing dealer, because they'd never give me the car I wanted at the price shown on their website, his demeanor very quickly pivoted back to the snotty, insolent person I dealt with the previous day. He proceeded to ask, "Well, did they?" with a bit of a sneer. I said nothing, but turned to the side and clicked the remote for my new car so the horn would give a few chirps. He said, "Good for you," in a rather curt tone, and walked away, leaving the poor salesperson on his own. I shook that salesperson's hand, thanked him for his time, and turned around to leave. The receptionist spoke up as I walked past her and asked in a rather chipper voice if I needed any further assistance. I politely responded that no, the other dealership had provided me exactly what I needed, and I was all set. To make things just that little bit better, as I passed the couple sitting in the waiting area, I saw them exchange looks with each other that seemed to say, "Perhaps we should go to the dealer I mentioned." I said nothing further and walked out of the building wearing the smile of a winner. TLDR car dealer treats me poorly and won't honor the price they list for a car. Tells me that I should waste my time and go to a competing dealer in the area, because they also won't honor the price they list for the car, but the competing dealer does honor the price, and I get a fine new car at a very nice price. The malicious compliance was flawless. The salesperson's dismissive attitude led to an unforgettable experience. Not only did OP get a better deal elsewhere, but his returning with the new car proved the first dealership's arrogance wrong and humiliated him well.